Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DH Sparks conversation on the budget day. The biggest takeaway of the budget was for me that it was less than 2 hours. After the marathon budget speech that we had last year, this time it was under 2 hours. It was wrapped up very quick, in fact, and it it has to be seen in tandem with the other 4 or 5 mini budget sessions that we had throughout the pandemic. So all of that put together gives a comprehensive picture. I have with me a whole bunch of experts to talk about the budget and the key takeaways from the budget. Let me just introduce first myself. I'm Anupam Manur. I'm assistant professor at Takshashila Institution. Along with me, I have Mohan R. Lavi, who's a chartered accountant and partner at KP Rao and Co. I also have Mrin Agarwal, who's a finance educator and money mentor. And finally, I have A. Murali, who's advisor to the Bangalore Chamber of Industry and Commerce and vice president of Toyota Tsusho India. So, in fact, we are 4 M's, if you please, to talk about the budget. And welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you could join me, both our dear panelists and our listeners. And I just want to start off with some of the big takeaways in terms of the macroeconomics. Probably the biggest takeaway was the big push towards infrastructure and capital expenditure. And this is in tune with the national infrastructure pipeline that's been spoken about from last year. And so a lot of the big chunk of the budget was in fact dedicated towards talking about infrastructure, talking about big capital investments, power, water supply, and also there's also significant talk about reconstruction of the bad assets. So we'll come to all of that in a while. But before, there will be a time when we'll comb through the fine print of the budget documents and we'll read big column inches on that later. But this is mostly for quick impressions of what we heard today. So just to bring in the voice of our experts, I first call upon Mohan Lavi. Firstly, welcome to the show. And I just want to get your first quick impressions. What did you think of our budget?
Yeah, from the point of view of taxation, actually, the good thing is that there was absolutely no change in the rates of tax, which is a huge, plus. And there was a talk prior to the budget of there being some COVID cess levied.
Right.
That we have something called as infra development cess, agri infra development cess. So that's more on the indirect taxation side than on the direct taxation side. But if you actually look at the fine print, what has happened is there have been a lot of amendments which have been announced in the memorandum. And there have been a little bit done on the GST front also, though not very significant. So my personal take is that, when we were just looking at the budget speech, the first part seemed to be, they're going to spend crores and crores of money on various projects, and we're wondering where the money is going to come from.
Right.
And there was not much by way of, tax, additional taxes levied. So my impression is that I think tax enforcement and tax collection is going to obviously increase a lot in the coming years.
Right. I think that's pretty much the reaction of the markets as well, where they're looking at, no big new taxes. There was talks about a wealth tax, etc. So since there's no really bad news, that itself should be considered as the first piece of good news. Yeah. So there was talk about, custom duty rationalizations, and there's a few import duties levied, etc. Is that big enough to be, worthy of note here, or is that just small changes?
They're actually more small changes only, not very significant. Nothing has changed like, drastically reduced or drastically increased. But they've got the sentiment of people by saying that, the gold, for example, custom duty on gold has been reduced. Right. So that was more a sentimental sort of an announcement than, any real marked change the gold as such. But I think what will actually cause worry is this AIDC on such a large number of items commencing from lentils up to wine. I don't even know how they've chosen such a eclectic variety of items. So what that will impact on the end prices, we really do not know about. Though, because the excess duty on petrol has been reduced, so the cess may not impact the petrol prices as such.
Right. But it is a significant cess, isn't it? It's 2.5 rupees on petrol per liter and 4 rupees on diesel. Yeah. That's a significant amount. You don't see that impacting petrol prices immediately?
No, because they reduced the basic excise duty.
Right.
And I think if there is any impact on petrol, I think the oil marketing companies will absorb it. I think they should be able to absorb that. I think.
Yeah, hopefully, because we had a small bet going on in our office of whether petrol will touch 100 rupees per liter in Bangalore. But
Then what will happen is once the petrol prices really go up so drastically, again, the logistics sector, movement, transport, there'll be a spill-on effect of inflation on those sectors also.
right. Actually, this is a perfect time to bring in Murli. Murli, we were discussing very briefly before the show on the impact of this agri cess and other cesses on the petrol prices and how it might impact the automotive sector, for instance. What is your take on that?
Yeah, good afternoon. I think it will have a far-reaching effect. The sort of spread that agri-tax has got, impacting every essential commodity which are used by common man. It will have an impact on the inflation. That's point number one. With regard to other taxes, with regard to that will also have an impact.
Right. If we look at, especially, I mean, the logistical sectors and so on, which was just about recovering from, post-pandemic, will this be a big enough hit that that might really impact the economy, or do you think that we could tide over this?
It will get tied over. I don't think it will not have a big impact.
All right. Thank you so much. But now coming on to the other aspect that you are, I think, are expert to speak on, which is the big infrastructure push. We've seen that probably the biggest part of the budget speech, and again also the biggest outlay, was on infrastructure, whether it is railways, whether it is actual road construction, and this for me it seems to be one of the best news coming out of the budget, because when we look at just the multiplier effect that comes in whenever there is capital expenditure, it seems to be highest, right? So what is your take on that big infra push? It was long time coming. It's also, do you think that's significant enough that it can help us tide over the recession due to the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks. See, the thing, the one heartening point in the budget is there's a lot of push on government spending, and this government spending is on capital expenditure. And we all need to understand that this entire push for capital expenditure is met by debt. Okay, and there is a cost to debt. There's an interest burden on all of us. We need to repay the debt at one point in time. The effect of the debt may not be felt this year, but I'm sure going forward, next 2 or 3 years down the line, you'll feel the effect of this debt and the interest burden on that. That will have a spiral effect on all of us, including some sort of a tweaking on the taxes and things like that. It's good that 5.54 lakh crore is spent on infrastructure, which includes rail infrastructure, road infrastructure, port, shipping, all of that, the entire gamut of infrastructure, gas, etc. So therefore, from the point of view of ease of living, it's going to help all of us generally. The only cost of concern would be how do you repay the debt, and who is going to repay the debt, and what point we are going to repay the debt. The taxes are not really tweaked this time. Okay, so I'm sure that will have an effect going forward.
Yeah, so picking up from that, we saw that, of course, the fiscal deficit numbers this time around was 9.5% of GDP, and that seems to be the highest it's been in as far as one can remember. And even in the 2008-9 crisis, I don't think the fiscal deficit numbers reached as high as 9.5% GDP. Next year, it's slated to be if I'm not mistaken, 6.8% next year, which is still significantly higher. What we also don't know is how are we going to reach from 9.5% to 6.8%? Where will that consolidation happen? Where will the financing happen? And how will we tide over this? One good part, though, is that we've been able to incorporate some of the off-budget financing items into the fiscal deficit number. So earlier, the situation was that when the government announced a particular fiscal deficit, the actual true fiscal deficit would be far, far higher because of the off-budget financing. I think some of that has been incorporated, so there's slightly better accountability and transparency in the fiscal deficit numbers, but it is still big. And as Murli was speaking about, I think this will lead to a sustained period of interest payments, and that itself, high fiscal deficit numbers can also lead to crowding out of private investment. We have to see how that happens, and these are all special times which calls for special measures such as huge government expenditure. But all of this will be kind of worth it and will be helpful if that huge government expenditure leads to a recovery. So we've been speaking about the supply side of the recovery path, which is the infrastructure push, the push in other aspects of the economy, even including the financial sector. But let's come to something which is probably far more relatable to the common man, which is the personal and direct taxes. So here's again, I would like to invite Brin's comments on the direct taxes. So there's not been a lot of changes in the direct tax codes. But there has been significant changes in, again, as even and Mohan was talking about, in probably the administration of taxation. So what are your comments on that, Brin?
Well, I think it's certainly a relief that there's been no tweaking of the major tax laws. People were expecting all sorts of things, starting from wealth tax, COVID tax, capital gains tax. There were all sorts of things going about. So I think it's a relief that the tax structure has been kept as is, even though I still feel it's very complicated for most individuals to really figure out whether they want to go with the old regime or the new regime. So I think that's a huge positive. But I think what worries me, and of course we need to really go through the fine print to see what's going to be the impact, is this whole agri-infra cess on all these consumption items that has been put, because it's been put on basics like lentils and dals and basin and stuff like that, right? So I think, it's been put on things like oils as well. So we really need to see what's going to be the impact of the cess on prices of products that we consume. And to that extent, I think that's my initial comment, that to me is a worry point. But otherwise, I think, the convenience of having pre-filled tax forms, the faceless tax assessment, tax files not being opened beyond 3 years and stuff like that, I think those are all good positives that are there. The other big positive, of course, is for senior citizens above 75. But here, I just want to say that, it's not as if the income is going to be tax-free. I do think that the TDS is still going to be applicable, but it's just going to be paid by the bank. And so the senior citizen does not need to go and file returns.
So it's ease of compliance, really, not really savings on taxes, but it's ease of, better compliance, or easier to comply for senior citizens, which I think matters in its own sense. Tax filing is always a dreadful and it's a burden for most people, especially for senior citizens. I would imagine that's some sort of relief. But let's speaking about, again, combining this macroeconomic angle with an individual perspective. One of the big reasons for this kind of recession during a pandemic is that people are not spending enough, especially with so much uncertainty. People would have lost jobs, or at least wouldn't have gotten their raises and bonuses, etc., etc., etc. And at such a time, if you remove if firstly there's been no ease in the tax level, so people are still paying pretty much the same levels of taxes. But on the other hand, essential items would probably become more expensive because of the cess. So overall disposable income would be reduced. So do you think that'll do enough? How much of an impact will that be in terms of aggregate demand? Will, when people go out and buy things, will that significantly reduce how much people can spend?
I don't think it may not be that significant, it's just that, but at the end of the day, what's happening right now is that the retail inflation is in any case high, right? So at some time it is going to feed into retail inflation, and that's going to impact people's spending power. Since it's going to be on relatively lesser priced items, of course, there is this cess that's being introduced on petrol and diesel, but from what I read, it's getting set off by the reduction in the import duty. So, we have to really wait and watch what's going to be the real impact of this particular cess. But yes, it does mean that for the common man, it means things will become more expensive.
Right. Speaking about things becoming more expensive, Mohan, back to you with regard to some of the indirect taxes that they're speaking about. There's cesses, or at least there's an increase in import duty on a few electronic items, mobile phones and chargers, something on leather shoes, etc. But mobile phones has been one area, or electronic items in general has been one area that we've been targeting for quite some time. In order to, part of it was strategic in nature because we're importing from China. Now it is also to shore up revenues. How do you see this playing out?
I think this is just an extension of what has been happening for the last few years. And I think, at one point of time, there was something called as an anti-dumping duty, which was being levied. So now this is coming in the way of this customs duty increase. because an anti-dumping duty would involve, foreign trade and all that stuff, so there'll be some issues coming in from that point of view. So they've just sort of put this in here. The idea is to ensure that those items become costlier and, to encourage the local this thing. So I think that's a very clear thing. The only thing, Anupam, is that, there are some items which are chosen every single year for an increase. Right. And like, for example, this year, I think steel has been a beneficial impact of steel, right? And textiles has become costlier now because apart from, nylon, all other textiles have actually, there's been a reduction in the rate. So the point is, how is this picking and choosing happen? With what intention is this happening, right? So it's not because of revenues, it's not because of, it's just, I think, happening on a basis wherein they just want to reduce it, they reduce it, that's all. Some strategic, like mobile phones, definitely. But others seem to be just cosmetic, that's all.
Right. But even there, experts would argue that just by putting an import duty and not changing any of the structural items about Indian economy will not really help local manufacturers, right? We've seen this. We've seen how this has played out. In fact, since 2016, we've been increasing the import duty on electronic items, and that has not really translated into a booming domestic industry in any of these factors, right? So because a lot of the times you need these which will feed in as inputs into the other outputs. So I don't see how that will actually play out. And given that we have such a large population and we're talking about a telecommunication revolution in a sense, putting an import duty would probably go against helping a lot of our own citizens, right? Because mobile phones becoming expensive is not really in our best national interest.
Right. Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, this has been playing out, as you said, for the last few years. I think where the government actually missed the bus on this was in GST. They would have really given they really wanted to encourage some local manufacturing. I think they should have done some sort of a special scheme for GST, for some sectors which they wanted to encourage domestic production in. That does not seem to have happened. So I think, there are two ways you can handle this. One is increase import duties. Second is, increase or incentivize local manufacture.
Right.
Ideally speaking, both should happen together.
Right.
But here we are doing it on a year-on-year basis. 1 year we're reducing the duties, next year we're trying to incentivize local manufacturers. So it's not being a joint effort.
Correct. Right. And on GST itself, budget would not be probably the perfect time to announce this. But in the last year or so, we've been wondering whether there's going to be some sort of harmonization of the GST rates from, the 5+ rates. I call it 5+ because you got 0, something in between, which is a 3, etc. Then 8, 18, 12, 18, and 28. And then there's other cesses on luxury items, etc. Do you see a rationalization of GST rates anytime? I mean, this is not really a budget question, but I want to talk about GST since we're here.
No, if you had... last year, the finance minister made an announcement that she would preferably like to make only one annual changes in the GST rates, though it is not translated into reality. She has made an announcement that there will be some change in the the inverted duty structure, which is actually having an impact on many sectors. But I don't see too much of a rationalization happening because we should remember, Anupam, that revenues are now coming in at a good clip, right?
Right.
So there was 1.19 trillion last year. So nobody's going to rock the boat on that now, right?
Right.
So there's no point in trying to rationalize things when things are going so well. But as I said, I think what has happened significantly, especially over the last year on GST, is this fake invoicing thing. Mm-hmm. Because of which I think the government and the department is becoming extremely stringent in terms of collection. And there is actually a provision in the budget in the income tax for attachment of assets in case there's a fake invoicing. So if you do a fake invoicing in GST, even your income tax, you could get those assets also, taken away by the department. So it's going to be a little bit of I think, as I said, collection is going to be a little bit more stringent. So we need to be a little bit more vigilant on that. But I don't see too many changes happening on the rates front anytime soon now.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Murli, I just want to draw your attention again. One of the things that I found really exciting about the budget was this, at least they're talking about a framework for privatization of, not really privatization, but providing alternatives for power supply, where you have at least competition in the power sector. So especially, given your role as to do with the Bangalore industry and Chamber of Commerce, I just want to get your views on we've in Karnataka, especially, we've had chronic kind of power problems, right? In terms of the power supply, industries are always hurt, and so on. So, how big of a move would this be, where you have players to choose from, and will that help in continuous and uninterrupted power supply to industry?
Well, this is just an announcement right now. It would take a couple of years to really fructify, I believe. So there is also a good move to incentivize solar energy and other alternative sources of energy. 1,000 crores has been laid out for the purpose. I'm sure that Karnataka would benefit out of that, and it will also help in bringing down the power cost, which is the industry has been crying loud that the power cost in Karnataka is quite high and requires to be brought down significantly. And MSMEs are badly being hit because of this power tariffs. So I think going forward, I'm sure the regulators will look into that and see how best they can remedy the situation.
Right. The other really big this thing, which again I'm personally very excited about, is at least the conversation taking place on the the stressed assets in the banking sector. So one of the things that has been chronically really affecting the rate of investments in the economy is the fact that our banks are stressed in terms of the assets they have, that they're not really, the credit offtake for industries is extremely low, and so on. So now that we're talking about a bad bank, which can, in some sense, it's an asset management company which can buy off the bad assets from these banks. Yeah, and then sell it off. How much do you think that will help in terms of just improving credit flow to industry at a time when, especially, I think industries really require it? That, along with the second aspect, which is kind of tied, is this thing about corporate bond market. So corporate bond markets, I think there has been an announcement on corporate bond market in pretty much every single budget, but it's not really fructified. It's one of those things. But if those two things happen in parallel, that can really help in financing to industry, right?
Well, I think the setting up this bad loan bank is one of the measures to clean up the balance sheet. They remove all the items that have been creating a shadow in the balance sheet, to move it out to one more entity. And in addition to that, you also infuse capital into the public sector banks. So that will shore up the balance sheet. That's one way of looking at marketing the public sector banks to the public in future. The second way is that these asset management banks or bad loan banks are being set up. It's also important who is going to manage that bank. Is it going to be privatized, or is it going to be again enhanced the public sector? If it's going to be enhanced the public sector, the decision-making powers or decision-making speed at which this has to be moved forward is also needs to be focused. It would be better if private-public partnership, or if it is given to the private sector. I think that would benefit the overall scheme of things.
Right. Just any final big takeaway for you from the budget? What that you see as something which can have a big impact?
Well, the scrappage policy, what has been announced for automotive industry, is a good move. What is called a voluntary scrappage policy for passenger cars over 20 years, and then commercial vehicles of 15 years. Yeah. We need to look into the details of how that will be implemented, but that announcement itself is a good move. The labor codes implementation is definitely, again, a welcome measure. So that will help us in improving the ease of doing business ranking in India to a large extent. I'm sure that going forward, we'll hit in the top 50. That's another second takeaway I can see. The foreign trade policy, which is going to be announced in the near future, I see some tinkering, or that's also in the way that policy works currently. So that's also a good measure. The insurance sector being opened from 49% to 74%, of FDIs, that is also a welcome measure, I would say.
Right. On the insurance sector,
and
I think
push for infrastructure, push for government spending. That will help us in improving the GDP. So the government is expecting a GDP at around 11% around next year. Much of that is going to come from the infrastructure spending.
Right. Yeah. The move to, I think, increase the FDI limits on insurance is, again, it's quite welcome. It also gives a way for many of the people who had invested a lot for them to exit, right, so that they can sell off to the foreign players. That's quite an interesting move that was there. They're also talking about LSE going public with the IPO, etc., which is again, we've to see how it will play out, but that's also quite interesting. Mrin, coming back to you, we're talking about there were some changes in terms of the FM proposed capital gains in ULIPs to be taxed as equity mutual funds. Your take on that? You had yeah.
I think it's a great move, because for decades and decades and decades, ULIP has been one of the most missold product to investors. It's a product that does not give you inflation-adjusted returns at all. It doesn't beat inflation. And I think there was a huge disparity in terms of two market-linked instruments. So you have ULIPs and you have mutual funds, which are both market-linked instruments, investing into markets and generating returns. But there was one that's been given, all sorts of, like you have a tax deduction and it's completely tax exempt. But the mutual fund gets neither. So I think it's a good move because I do see a lot of policies being sold on this whole thing of the returns being tax-free. And I think it's a good move to basically get some amount of tax parity, essentially, to a whole lot of these large, large insurance policies that are being sold, which are actually investment policies.
Right, right. So if I was, so I'm going to come from a personal investor. So if I'm a personal investor, how can I make use of this particular move?
Well, in the first place, you shouldn't be investing in investment-linked insurance since it does not beat inflation. But yes, to that extent now, certainly I think a mutual fund is a better way to invest because it's more transparent, it's more liquid, it's more flexible. So, from that perspective, the equity fund and ULIP are going to have similar taxation. So, of course, from a personal investment, you always need to do your homework rightly. And always look at the risk factors, right? So you see, with insurance, a lot of insurance is sold on guaranteed returns, which is not the case, right? Both are market-linked returns. So I think it's important to look at the risk factors in any investment before investing.
Right. And so importantly, and I couldn't catch a lot of this, unfortunately, but I'm just going to ask a very open-ended and vague question to you. But there were some changes in the EPF aspect as well, in terms of how corporates paid EPF and, even the way they deposited it, and they wanted, so you had a little bit more, I think, labor welfare measures through the EPF. So could you just elaborate on that for our listeners?
So there are two things that have happened. The first one is that there are many cases where the EPF is being deducted, but then it's not being paid to the government, right? It's not being given to the government by the employer. So those will not be allowed for deduction anymore, right? But I think if you ask me, and this is one of the really big negatives of this budget, if I have read it rightly, is the issue that if you have a contribution of more than 2.5 lakhs now to EPF, the interest on that is going to be taxable. So I think that's a very, very bad move because you have a lot of salaried people who save in EPF, not only EPF, they also save as VPF, which is the Voluntary Provident Fund. And it's a really bad thing for them because any contribution above 2.5 lakhs, the interest on it, which was completely exempt till now, is going to be taxable. So that really, to my mind, says that, you're limiting EPF investment at 2.5 lakhs a year.
Right.
Right. That's a big move. And, it was not talked about in the budget. We've read it in the document later on, but it's not been talked about in the budget yet.
Right. Okay. Thanks for then bringing that to our attention. I would have definitely missed it for sure. All right. I just want to, spend a couple of minutes now on just my take on some of these aspects in the budget, which is essentially, as I said, there's a couple of things that I was really interested about, which is the bad bank. If that finally brings some relief in terms of the overall financial sector, we're looking at increased credit flow to the industry, and we have to put this in the larger context of what is happening with our investment rate. So if you look at our gross capital formation, gross fixed capital formation has been falling from about 39% in 2012 to about 29%, a 10 percentage drop in about 10 years. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the big reasons for that is this twin balance sheet problem. So if some of these measures that we have been speaking about can solve that, I think our investment can get back on track. And once you have higher credit flow to industry, that will create, that will help in job creation, that will help in increased incomes, then people have more to spend. That will create demand. That's the road to recovery that we're talking about. So I see some kind of positive moves there. The other one that I think is part of this, the bad assets, is to do with the privatization of banks. So there was this announcement that they would privatize two public sector banks along with IDBI. So we have to really, that I think is really interesting announcement. So now, again, the government does not have a perfect record in terms of disinvestment from the previous years. They've been trying to disinvest. It really has not happened as much as we'd like it to be, as much as the government likes. Air India is a really sore spot on all of this because they've been trying to sell off Air India, but you don't have buyers. If you look at in that kind of context, I think it will be difficult to kind of sell or at least privatize these public sector banks. But the fact that they're looking at it seriously is probably a good first step. Because until now, they were just looking at merging some of these public sector banks. Now they're finally looking at privatizing some of this. I just want to, Mohan, you had a comment on this?
Banks?
Yeah.
For disinvestment as such, yeah.
Yeah, so disinvestment.
If you look at the record, it's really not been good. Every single year we have successfully, the Department of Disinvestment gives out these numbers, but there's a huge gap. Obviously, there's a very, very huge gap, right? And in fact, many of the employees of these PSUs also are against this, the privatization. It would happen in the case of BEML also, I think, right?
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things. I think the disinvestment will also depend upon the quality of that asset which is being disinvested.
Right.
And if the asset quality is not good, obviously you will not get a good valuation for this. So I think instead of looking at a list of companies, they should look at disinvesting. They should probably look at only selling off one small portion of some really, like for example, the LIC IPO is a good example, right? Mm-hmm. So look at some star of these, what they call as mega PSUs, the mini ratnas or the mega ratnas as they call it, and try to sort of sell one small stake in that by retaining their the government stake in that. So I think that's the way to go about it. And some of these assets are really not good. So in fact, many of these assets will probably go to the bad bank also.
Right. Yeah. I think that's been the problem with Air India as well. One, it still has a few assets that are quite, in some sense they're worthy, which is basically the routes, the parking spots, and the physical asset of the airplane itself. But the valuation is a problem. The value that the government expects is not in tune with the market valuation. And I think that will happen with many of these public sector banks as well. So we have to see how that plays out. The government has to be a lot more realistic in what it expects from the disinvestment. Yeah.
May I interrupt? The government knows that it's not that very good in running businesses, going by its own history historically, and the step that is being currently taken to privatize two of the public sectors is only the initial, I would say, tip of the iceberg, where you could see many more to follow in the years to come. And that would also bring in quality in functioning and speedy decision making and non-interference of politicians in running the affairs of banks, public sector banks. There's a whole lot of things that will get eased out in going forward.
Yeah, hopefully that's what the way forward would be. Two steps. One is privatization of some of these things, and then the corporatization almost of the other even the public sector. Even the banks that remain in the public sector, you need a corporatization, right? Which is the reduction in the influence of the finance ministry in the appointment of the board, the chairman, the way it is run, etc. Who they give loan to. These have been classic kind of problem areas in the public sector banks. And going forward, we have to see how that happens. The other kind of important point about the disinvestment is that the actual target for disinvestment has been reduced from the previous year. Now, is that, I've seen kind of very quickly, I've seen mixed reactions to that. One set of commentators have been saying that you've lowered your ambitions for disinvestment. The other set of commentators have said this is far more realistic. Anyway, you're not going to meet your target. Let us at least be realistic about it. So, any quick thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a good thing that they will at least the expectations are down, right? So, yeah. So you not miss by 90%, you probably miss only by 40%. So I think that's a good positive actually, right? Right. And I think they're getting a little bit more realistic on this because if you looked at 2018, I think the target was some very high figure and they've gotten a very low figure. So I think in a way it's good actually.
Right. So I think we're just about drawing to a close of this panel discussion. So I'm just going to open the floor to all our three panelists. If you have any final comments or concluding comments that you want to.
Well, one important thing that I thought missing was that in a push for R&D, now Atmanirbhar and Make in India programs on Unwell. It would have been nice that sort of an incentive or a concession being given on companies which are into R&D focus or having patentable products. That would also get linked with the PLI scheme. That is something that is missing in this particular budget.
Hey, thanks for that. So again, you could focus on, what do you think was the biggest missed opportunity as well in the budget, as picking off from this particular comment.
So I think, it would have bbeen nice, and I had also written about this, that there needs to be a lot of focus in pushing people into doing retirement savings. And, NPS is a great market-linked instrument that exists. So actually, one of my budget suggestions was to actually increase that limit. And it would have been nice to see some sort of focus out there. Again, coming back to the EPF point, the way I look at it is that you have the new wage code that's coming in, which tells you that basic needs to be 50% of the salary. And at the same time, you're going to be taxing EPF contribution above 2.5 lakhs. So it somewhere doesn't make a lot of sense to me right now. But I think, my what I would tell investors out there would be that continue your investments. And, all of these budgetary proposals really never actually can break your portfolio or make such a big impact on your portfolio. It's finally what you can control, what's in your hands is what you really need to focus on as far as your money is concerned.
Right, thanks for that. Mohan, any last thoughts or comments or any missed opportunities?
I have nothing to say on this entire faceless assessment thing. So there's more from the administration point of view. I'm keeping my fingers crossed here, Anupam, because I don't know how this is actually going to go out. They're saying that it's going to also go to the tribunal level, and actually for the taxpayer, justice is received only at the tribunal level. If you get the internal appellate tribunal level. But at the ground level, I know that many of these things are not actually working out very well. In fact, even Mrin told us during this budget also, when we were discussing, she told me offline that she had a very bad experience with the department. She's so. And tax laws are getting more complicated. They're getting more complex. We've got some ICTS, we've got some Indias coming in and all those things. I don't see that education happening at that tax officer level for them to understand the complexities of this tax law. So I'm really keeping my fingers crossed here that this goes well, because you could end up having a tax officer somewhere sitting in Jammu and Kashmir or Lucknow who doesn't know anything about what you're doing, right? And I think that sort of outreach program has to happen from the department point of view. And it's too massive a job. So my thing is that they're bringing this too fast. They should probably slow down a little bit and do it on a gradual basis.
Right. Hope they're listening to you then. All right. I think we're going to end there. Thank you so much all for joining in, both the panelists and of course the listeners. We're going to end here. The big summary, I think, is that there's no really big bad news, at least coming out of the budget. There are a few interesting developments. Of course, execution is pending. We have to see how that plays out. And this has to be again seen in continuation with some of the other Atmanirbhar packages that were announced earlier this year. So seeing all of this together, I think we can say that there's no bad news at least, and everyone seems to be just about reasonably happy. Few missed opportunities, as with any budget that you can think of. So on that note, thank you everyone for joining in, and hope you have a nice day and weekend ahead.
Thank you.